Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles.
We are going to, we're talking about Kol Isha, the, prohibition, maybe prohibition about a man hearing a woman's voice, which comes up prominently in this episode with Yochai, the Haftarah teacher, who doesn't want to teach Re'ut because she's a woman, and she's sort of adamant, right, about I want to learn Haftarah. I'm not reading in front of men, I'm reading in front of women. And he's like, never, still can't do it. And he keeps saying lo matim. It doesn't feel appropriate, or lo tzanua. It's immodest. And she kind of keeps.
I think he says ze lo mekubal, and the only reason I remember that is because at Camp Vermont in California, that was told to us many times. That was the word. That was the wording that was used. Yeah.
Well, about what? About reading.
That it wouldn't be good for him to teach her because ze lo mekubal.
Right. But you're not saying with this and this topic. You're just saying frequently that was a phrase that was used.
It was used. It was used in the show.
God, no, yeah.
That's what he said. Okay, sorry. I didn't mean to derail you. I was just excited.
No. So we were talking about the parameters, and I said, this is one of those topics. I feel like there's a number of topics when it comes to negia, physical contact between the sexes, when it comes to Kol Isha, that we'll probably be coming back to in a variety of contexts, because they're sort of big topics that kind of are somewhat omnipresent. Kol Isha is not omnipresent in this show, but I'm sure it'll be up here. And we were talking about the parameters of when that applies, why it applies. And, we saw how the original Torah sources speak about women singing. Miriam sings, Deborah, the prophet, sings. And actually the reason that we have, prohibition actually comes from Shir Shirim, Song of Songs, where the man in the scenario, in the parable or the poem, says to the woman who he's courting, attracted to, whatever, that let me see your face, let me hear your voice, because your voice is sweet. And from that idea of a woman's voice being sweet, Rashi says, because it's described as being sweet, we learn from that a woman's voice is desirable. And the word in the Hebrew in Shir Shirim is that her voice is arev, ayin resh vet, which in this context means sweet. And from that, we get a statement in the Talmud in the name of Shmuel, who says, Kol b'isha erva, right? It's a kind of a play on words, because Shir Shirim uses the word arev, ayin resh vet. Erva is ayin resh vav, hey. But it's sort of the same kind of word, and this idea that a woman's voice is like erva, is like nakedness, because it's attractive, it's going to prevent a man from, being able to focus on what he's supposed to do, and there's a question about whether this is only if he's reading Shema or doing other religious things, or if it's sort of a universal prohibition. And there's a spectrum of views around it, but generally we see, there's a story, of Rav Yehuda won't say hi to Yalta because he doesn't want to say hi, and hers to say hi back to him, because that would be Kol Isha, right? That's kind of the extreme version. But elsewhere we see, conversations about Zmirot around the Shabbat table, or women singing behind the Mechitza and Shul, or all these kinds of contexts. And in which cases does Kol Isha apply? In which cases is it problematic for men to hear? And two of the things that we saw come up in some of the sources is that if it's multiple people singing and the woman isn't it's 100% about the weakness of men. Yeah. Karen, that's 100%. And with all of these things, right? It's not about women doing anything wrong. It's about men being unable to maintain their focus on what they're supposed to focus on because they're,
men.
Because they're distracted. Exactly. And so a couple things that we saw for one, that if it's, and this comes up with Re'ut, that if it's multiple people singing, if the man and woman are singing together, then you can't easily differentiate the voices, and so maybe that makes it okay. Rav Ovadia Yosef, the former chief rabbi of Israel, they said that in his house, women and men sang Zmiro together, family, but like they sang Zmiro together, and he said as long as we're all singing together and no woman is singing in a higher pitch or like stronger strength than other people to where like her voice really stands out, it's fine. And similarly, for Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, kind of like the father of modern Orthodoxy in Germany, and Rav Hildesheimer back also in Germany, talked about how at their tables women would sing Zmiro together with the men, but again the togetherness and the context of it being kind of religious-ish singing makes it different than Madonna. I remember I bring that example because I don't know if other people know Rabbi Jordan Soffer. I feel like Rebecca might know him, but he's a rabbi. I grew up at Camp Ramah with him, and he also went to my yeshiva, Yeshiva Chovei Torah. And I remember him telling a story that someone invited him to a Madonna concert when he was in rabbinical school, and he was like, "No, thanks for the invitation. I'm not going to go." And someone responded, and the person responded and said, "Why not?" And he said, "Oh, because of Kol Isha." And the person was like, "Really? A Chovei? Like, you care about Kol Isha?" Side note, my brother-in-law, Joel, who Rabbi Schatz knows very well, is pretty strict about Kol Isha, in any case. But the person was like, "Really? At Chovei, which is pretty liberal, they care about Kol Isha." And he's like, "Look, when you think about what Kol Isha is supposed to be about like a woman's voice being seductive and all of that, he's like, Madonna, that's like exactly what she's trying to do. Like, it's like even if I'm not strict on it in general, there are cases that are like, okay, fine, that's exactly what's going on here. But like singing Zmiro around a Shabbos table, maybe not."
But Rabbi Pernick, this segment is actually dealing with something a little different in that she wants to learn the Haftorah and Torah reading,
right?
Which is a wholly more serious segment for a woman than just singing.
Correct. So in this case, we're talking about Haftarah, though she did mention Torah reading. That's its own separate class that I imagine, again, I haven't seen much of Srugim past where we are now. I imagine that's something that might come up, but women reading Torah is its own thing. Haftarah is a little bit different. Rabbi Schatz.
But no, good.
Can we just like take approximately 8 steps back and just like explain what I've had a few comments that people are just confused what we're talking about.
Sure.
You can do that or I can do that, but like let's just give a little bit of background.
Why don't you go ahead and do that? Because I've been talking a lot.
Okay. Oh, thank you. So this idea of Kol Isha that Rabbi Pernick just explained to everybody comes up in this week's Parsha, this week's episode. Actually, also, well, whatever, it doesn't matter. In this week's episode, because when exactly what Eileen was just mentioning, that when she goes to say that she wants to learn the Haftarah, that even though it's just going to be in front of women, he seems to have some kind of problem with it. And he looks up in the sources if it's okay, and he's not really so sure. And we, the viewers, seem to think that maybe it has something to do with the fact that they'll be spending more time together, or that he thinks that it will be inappropriate for those reasons. But really, it's because of what Rabbi Pernick was just describing, which is that a woman's voice, more so than a man's voice, though there are also sources for why a woman alone shouldn't listen to a man's voice, that a woman's voice is seen as seductive and as something that could create a situation in which a man is unable to focus if it's in a prayer setting, right? If it's in like a shul setting, or a situation in which a man is left to feel uncomfortable or even have inappropriate thoughts. That's always my favorite, when the rabbis are like, but they could have inappropriate thoughts and you control their brain, so clearly don't do anything. So this idea here is that women wouldn't sing or use their voices in such a way that somehow the man would be affected in any kind of mental, physical, spiritual way. So those of you who are confused, are you less confused now? Does this make more sense? Just nod if you are getting more information. Yeah, okay. Why is Haftarah different? like Christian people who have thoughts. I don't know what that means, but I can tell you why Haftarah is different. Oh, you're still typing. Okay. Rabbi Pernick might have more information on this than I do. The reason that Haftarah, in my opinion, is different is because the sources specifically say Torah or Shema or Kriyat Shema. They don't actually speak to the idea of reading from the prophets. So it could be seen as different. Like there are more modern Orthodox shuls in Los Angeles. For when a girl decides to become a bat mitzvah, she has a service. Whether or not that modern Orthodox shul is liberal enough to have men also in the room, or if it's just a woman's service, but the girl would come before, again, whichever community it is, and it would be able to potentially read the Haftarah, but also be able to give a drush. So that seems to be, and again, Rabbi Pernick knows more about this world than I do, but that seems to be something that is kind of more available and more lenient in terms of women's participation because the sources don't mention it as a thing that they cannot do. However, the conversation that we're having is this kind of bigger umbrella issue of Kol Isha, of just hearing a woman's voice, period, as opposed to around what. Do you have other thoughts on that? Or was that kind of...
Yeah, no, I mean, so with regard to Haftarah, I was looking if there were sources that speak to Kol Isha, Kol Isha specifically with Haftarah.
There are none.
There are none. There's nothing I could find also. Okay, so we both were unable to find anything. When we think about parts of a prayer service, so there's leading davening, there's like being the shaliach tzibor, or the shots, as we like to say.
Very good.
So that has its own reasons why in an Orthodox setting women won't lead for men, which is related to the obligations of prayer, that men are obligated to pray 3 times a day. Women generally are not seen as having an obligation to pray 3 times a day. Someone who doesn't have an obligation can't fulfill for someone who does have an obligation. So that's why when it comes to prayers, women don't lead for men. So it's not Kol Isha, it's actually about fulfilling a mitzvah for for something that for you is optional and for someone else is mandatory. Then there's Torah reading, which is actually a communal obligation. It's not an obligation on any individual to read Torah, but it's an obligation on the community to hear the Torah read. So there are what are called partnership minyanim, which some people might have heard of, which are places that basically take the halacha, the Jewish law, kind of as far as it can go. Okay, so right. So talking about Michael saying at the Shar, girls can read both Torah and Haftarah in a women's service and give a drush in front of the whole congregation. So also in partnership minyanim, which are like sort of Orthodox, but like really on the far edges of Orthodoxy, women will lead, for example, Psuke de Zimra and
Kabbalat
Shabbat, but not Shacharit, Mincha, Musaf, Mariv. Because those are things where you're fulfilling the obligation for someone else, and they will read Torah because, again, the obligation of Torah reading is an obligation on the community, and it even says in the Gemara in Masechet Megillah. I took this source out because we weren't talking about Torah reading specifically, but it says in the Gemara that anyone can be called up for the 7 aliyot, including women and children, but we don't call up women because of kavod hatzibor, because of respect for the community. So that's a whole argument in its own right around Torah reading. Haftarah is different because Haftarah is a custom that we have to read from the prophets. It has no halachic status, like you're not fulfilling an obligation by reading Haftarah. So there's greater leniencies around Haftarah than either Torah reading or leading the prayer service.
And there are places that still hold by this, right? There are communities in which the Haftarah is seen as something that is more available, right, to girls and to their families than a Torah service would be, especially if you're in a more liberal, I guess, a modern Orthodox community where you actually might be able to do that also in front of the whole community and not just in a separate minyan that you would create for women. I'll just share, this has nothing to do with Haftarah, but it has to do with women's voices. One of my teachers from Ziegler Mimi Feigelson, who many of you know, or at least have heard the name of. She was one of the first female Orthodox rabbis who was ordained by Reb Shlomo Carlebach. And she never read Torah when we were in rabbinical school because she didn't read in the context of a mixed minyan where there were men and women. And when I was in Israel, I was visiting for something, and she told us, those of us who were in town, she told us that she would be reading Torah in a women's minyan. And the females in rabbinical school with me and I went to this, and it was extremely emotional to be able to see a teacher who has taught you so much Torah, but for whom never shared her voice in reading Torah in front of the community. To actually hear her read Torah for the first time was just remarkable. And so I just want to add that a lot of this conversation, I'm sure, is coming across as extremely sexist or a way that is silencing women's voices. And I just want you to know that even as a person who doesn't find myself in those kinds of contexts regularly, that there are ways in which women who are not using their voices in mixed settings are using their voices in very profound and very beautiful ways in these women's minyanim. So I don't want it to sound like it's not happening at all. It just might not be happening in front of us. So I wanted to share that story. But I think, Michael, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to add one quick, sorry.
Go ahead.
Okay, I'll add a quick little caveat to that. So you might have noticed that there's a little conversation there where Ifat says to her, it's like something like, why don't you go, read with the American feminists? And she responds like, I can't say their accents, whatever. So in that Jerusalem bubble, so there's a well-known minyan called Shira Chadasha, which is largely American, and is that partnership minyan style that I was talking about of, where women will lead Kabbalat Shabbat, men will lead Mariv, women will read Torah there. But and that's actually sort of where the origins of partnership minyanim are sort of in that context. And again, it's a very American, American, yeah.
Their newsletter was the only place that I found any sources on women reading Haftorah.
Oh, really?
When I was looking for sources, that was the only place I found.
But, Ruud just saying, no, that's not what I'm doing. They don't explicitly talk about Shira Chadasha, but I think it's sort of in code. And she's like, no, I'm doing a women's minyan. So this is before my time, but back, in the 70s, at least one such partnership minyan, Norm says, in LA. And yeah, so, and sometimes they'll require 10 men, 10 women. Sometimes they don't. Sort of different minyanim have different standards with that. But when this sort of originated, I think in the 70s, it began with women's tefillah groups. That was the first thing where women said, we can't read in front of men. Fine, we're going to start our own tefillah groups that are just women, and this type that Rabbi Schatz was talking about with Reb Mimi. And, we're going to do it in that way, and it's just women reading for women. We'll read Torah, we'll read Haftarah. We can even lead davening because we're not doing it for men, we're doing it for one another. Mm-hmm. And so that was kind of the first step. And then over time, it sort of moved to people say, well, we don't want to just be doing it for women, we want to do it for men. And so that's sort of the next stage in the progression was the partnership minyanim there. Yeah, Hugo, is that a...
We just wanted to tell you that several years ago when we were in Jerusalem, we actually went to Shir Hadashah, and it was absolutely the most amazing and most beautiful service that we had attended in a very, very long time, and certainly in Jerusalem, at least for my part.
Nice.
They have beautiful harmonies. They know how to sing really well in that community.
Yeah,
for someone who enjoys that, it's a great place to go. Yeah. Michael, you had something to say earlier. Do you want to still share?
Yeah. A number of the folks at KJ in New York, which is a traditional Orthodox synagogue, when I was there one Shabbat, I was told that, and Rabbi Josh must know about this, and maybe it's a partnership minyan, but there are a couple of minyans, at least in New York City, where men and women sit on different, there's still effectively a mechitza, but they both get called to the Torah, have aliyot, and then they go back to each side. I guess it's, as Rabbi Josh would say, it's right at the edge of modern Orthodoxy.
Right. Yeah, so those are partnership minyanim. In partnership minyanim, there's still a mechitza. There's still a mechitza, and there's people are sitting, on opposite sides, but someone from the women's side comes up to do certain things. Men come up for certain things, and aliyot go back and forth. Haftarah goes back and forth between them. So you see a number of those in larger cities. It's not a rabbi of mine. Once commented that he said, I'll be okay with partnership minyanim when I see a partnership minyan that actually functions as a synagogue and has like daily minyanim and like does, because usually they're sort of once a month, sometimes more than that, but like they really typically function as a minyan, but not as like a shul. Like it's usually kind of people who don't, often younger people who don't want the commitments of a shul, but want somewhere to go on Friday night and have this kind of singing. So,
that's what I had been told by this fellow at KJ, that it was a very occasional type of thing, maybe once a month, every couple of weeks,
right.
But not an actual synagogue.
But there are some. There's one in Manhattan on the Upper West Side called, I'm forgetting, which is huge. I mean, they have like 150 people at every Shabbos. And they meet in a gym. Not right now, probably, but yeah. So some of them are large, some of them are smaller.
Okay, so do we want to just go back for a second to like the Kol Isha piece?
For sure.
Okay. So I just want to say quickly about Kol Isha that one of the things that I think is, as a person who sings, the thing that's hardest about Kol Isha is that often, and there's a source on this that if I can find it quickly, I'll share it, but that, women were given a voice. They were given a way of utilizing their vocal cords, whether it's to speak or to sing. And it wasn't to seduce men. That wasn't what our voices were given to us for. And there is something that is inherently difficult about women being told that they can't use something that they were given, such as their voice, just like being told you can't use your legs, because it's going to affect someone else. And I think one of the things that Rayut did really beautifully in this episode was that she fought for that. She said, no, I'm doing this in a way that is completely tznius, right? I'm doing this in a way that is not going to make anybody uncomfortable. You have to get over the fact that you're known as the best teacher and that I want to learn from you. And I want to know how to do this so that I can do it for future generations in memory of my father. So he like gives in a little bit when he finds out that it's in memory of her father, just like he had just shared that his father had died. And so they kind of, ease into it a little bit. But you notice that she starts singing and he freaks out. And he's like, no, I cannot listen to your voice. And there's nothing happening. She's just singing. But then they realize, and this was the thing that what Rabbi Pernick said, and I started to chuckle, because I think that there's something about Kol Isha that makes it seem as though, okay, if a man and a woman sang together, that's fine, because the woman will just be quieter and demure and very feminine, and a man will just share his voice in the way that a man's supposed to. And that's not what it should be about, right? If a man and a woman are going to sing together, they're going to sing together. It shouldn't be, but I have to be louder than you. And I think that she was willing to give into that because that was the only way it was going to happen. But I just wanted to point that out, that there is something very difficult about women being told they can't use something that was given to them, and that it's because men just can't control themselves. So I don't know, Rabbi Pernick, if that was something that you talked about or if that was a source that you talked about, but I just wanted to bring that up. And now to Rabbi Pernick, so I'm talking to you, Josh. You can answer.
And we talked to, so we did speak about that a little bit, but more in the context of like Zmirot around the Shabbat table, where they said Rav Ovadia said people saying at his table, but it was like as long as no woman, I guess, is being louder. I guess if a man is being louder, it's not an issue, right? But that point about as you're saying, women are given this gift, and that's sort of how it's described in Song of Songs and Shir Shirim. Women have beautiful voices and men don't, is essentially what it says, what Rashi says there. And it's like, okay. And like, because they have these beautiful voices. Now we need to put a cage on it so that it doesn't affect men, right? Like it's kind of, even more than other issues. And again, it's not saying it couldn't be used at all. It's just, saying around men that men shouldn't be listening for this. But it's certainly, like you said, if you're saying that men shouldn't be listening to women singing, then that ends up impacting the kinds of settings in which women can sing, because in many places there's going to be men there, right? So it does certainly create that difficulty for women who enjoy singing, that there's sort of limited opportunities to do that in an Orthodox context.
It was also interesting that he said, I'm religious, and she said, so am I, right? As if she was religious, she wouldn't have even begun to ask the question. And I really liked that, because I think that the idea of being religious or being in a denomination, just she pushes that envelope a little bit by saying, like, I'm also religious. Like, you can't tell me that I'm not religious just because I asked to do something that you've never been asked before. And I appreciate that, because you can't tell just by looking at someone, what their practices are around Kol Isha, of all things. Anybody have any comments or questions or thoughts on this?
I was wondering if the rabbi who was teaching her eventually, whether he had any interest in her, because when she met him the first time and she left, he went to, I think, the door or the window and followed her out. Looked through the door hole or whatever. And so I'm just wondering if he was just curious, or maybe he never met too many women before or something like that.
Yeah. First of all, I don't think he's a rabbi, which I'm not correcting you, but I just want to make it clear, because I think that there is something maybe even better about the fact that he's not a rabbi in this context. Mm-hmm. Just based on, I'm sure we'll talk more about yichud and stuff, but I think that would become more complicated if he was held to a different standard than just a guy who knows trope. I think it's a TV show, and I don't know. I assume that, yes, he probably starts to have some kind of affection for the fact that she was really adamant about wanting to learn from him. She told him he was the best teacher, right? She puffs him up, and so, why not like her a little bit based on that? But I also think that because the show, unlike this class, isn't going into the halachic pieces here, that this idea of Kol Isha is supposed to be something that is seductive. And so if they want their audience to imagine that without having a class in Kol Isha, then his approach to the window to watch her walk to her motorcycle is a sweet way of people understanding that he is somehow becoming more attracted to her by her voice and her intrigue with learning Torah.
And I'll also just note, and this will come up when we talk about negia also, like physical contact, that there is a differentiation between someone who you're attracted to versus, someone who is of a different generation, married, right? Like all these kinds of things that, hearing someone who's 40 years older than you and married with kids and grandkids singing, like, doesn't have the same, or with negia when it comes to touching, it's the same kind of thing. Like, some people will say, no, I won't listen to any woman sing, and I won't touch any woman. But when you actually look at the halachic sources, it's not so clear. It's sort of things that are like touch that's sort of seductive in some way, and same thing with the voice. Like, it's right, it comes from this shir hashirim, this song of songs thing about the man seeking this woman's seductive voice, which is clearly a romantic relationship, even though we understand it as being, God and Israel seduction. But it's a different kind of thing. So, like, here we certainly see it where, they're like contemporaries, similar age, both religious, in an apartment together, singing. Like, that is different than, going to a concert of someone who's older and sitting a distance away. Like, it's just a very
Madonna.
Madonna is different because Madonna is intentionally seductive, but Jewish choral music is different.
Interesting. I was just going to say something. You totally threw me off. Okay, AJ had a question, and then maybe I'll remember.
Well, it's a bit of a complicated question. One quick comment to Robert regarding his mentioning of the window. Because it's a visual medium, it's an interesting allusion to an ancient representation of the woman at the window and a bit of a gender role reversal. Instead of a woman at the window, you'd have a man at the window. So I don't know if that was intentional on the part of the producers or someone else in the production area, but potentially, because they like to do stuff like that. My question regards history and rabbinic history. And I'll start, I don't want to carry you down a Socratic path here, so let me just confess the whole question. I wanted to start with, was there a time difference between the reasoning of the honor of the community versus the seductiveness of a woman's voice? In other words, you have Kol Isha, the seductiveness, but you also have the whole presence of women in public being an affront to the honor of the community. Were those two decisions made at different times or at about the same time? And where the thread I'm pulling here is with regard to how it's being taught in the yeshivot. And I don't know, you probably do get quite a bit of history, but maybe not this kind of history. I'm wondering whether we have an understanding of is somebody doing any kind of work in terms of trying to ferret out how this misogyny, and I'm going to call it what it was, because I'm going to allege that it's Hellenistic value systems that were in place in the greater Mediterranean area at the time that rabbinic Judaism first began and was trying to reach back and assert its position of respectability and authority out of, the common value system, with the dominant power structure being completely male in a Hellenistic world. Not so much in a Roman world, and certainly not in a Persian world. So I'm just, have you heard, were you taught this in rabbinic school, or did you get any of that? Is there some historian out there that I don't know about yet that I'd love to read?
I mean, I'm sure there are certainly people who are examining that from a historical lens. The idea about anyone being called up to the Torah, but women not being called up because of kavod tzibor, respect to the community, that comes from a Tosefta, which is Mishnaic era. So that's, 2nd century, the first 2 centuries in Israel, so under Roman auspices. The idea about a woman's voice being erva, being sort of pseudo-nakedness, comes from Shmuel, who's an Amora. So that's already in Babylonia. So you're right, to think about the different contexts in which they find themselves. I think generally speaking, for sure, Judaism is always in conversation with the cultures in which it finds itself, right? Always. And I think the Torah and Tanakh generally are sort of, are often, what's the word I'm looking for? Subversive. That, having someone like Deborah the prophet and having Barak say, I'm not going to battle unless you come with me, and her saying, well, if I come with you, everyone's going to say a woman won the war, and Barak saying back to her, I don't care, I can't go unless you come with me, right? Like, clearly, when the text says that explicitly, and it's clearly acknowledging a value system in the world in which they live, in which a man would be seen as emasculated because a woman was necessary to come with him to battle. And he says that, I don't care, I need you, and it's true. She and then Yael ends up killing Sisera, right? So the Torah is just
allusion to a joke. Yeah. There was a joke embedded in that because ultimately it wasn't, they weren't talking about Devorah, they were talking about Yael. But anyway, I get So are you saying that it's really 2nd century BCE or CE? Thank you.
Common era.
CE. And then Babylonia, so you're going back to, we could go back to 5th century, but probably more recent than that.
Shmuel is like an early Amora, so he's probably 3rd or 4th century. 3rd or 4th century of the Common Era, yeah. So, yeah, but for sure, I mean, I think Judaism is none of this ever exists in a vacuum. It's always in conversation with the local customs and norms, always. So, yes, I would agree with that. And I'm not a historian enough to know how the difference between Roman and Greek and Babylonian values impact the ways that the Jewish rabbinic sources discuss these things.
I'm gonna read a question that was put in the chat, and I'm happy to answer it unless you would like to. So Bonnie said, what thinking and or commentary is there by the sages on actions that men can take in order to maintain or regain you definitely should answer this, or regain focus if necessary so that women do not have to be prevented from their normal and natural actions such as singing? You want to take
I'll let you take that one. You can take that one.
Oh, thank you. That's so nice. Okay. I mean, there isn't really, Bonnie, first of all, you'll be in my class tomorrow, and I'm going to bring some of these sources. So we can talk about it a little bit more tomorrow. But there are sources that do say that men's voices. Oh, this is what I was going to say before you made the Jewish choral comment. That when I was studying music in college, I studied with men whose voices were much more beautiful than women's, and that's just preference. Obviously, I can't say that everyone agreed with me, but I think that there are many ways in which people prefer one kind of singing over another, and for some people that's what they grew up listening to. For other people, it's just the tenor of someone's voice, no pun intended, in terms of what kind of range they sing in and all of that. So there is something to be said for men's voices being just as beautiful, if not seductive. That's not what it says in Shir HaShirim, which is what Rabbi Pernick was talking about earlier. But when we talk about it's not commentary, it's actual, it might be commentaries, whatever. It's sources where there are sages who talk about how women also shouldn't pay that much attention to a man's voice. That they shouldn't go to like a male chorus concert or something, right? That they should not be surrounding themselves with just male voices either. Now, we don't hear that as predominantly for exactly the fact that Rabbi Pernick brought up earlier, which is it's not something that is going to distract women from something that they're obligated to, right? If women aren't obligated to daven the Shema or daven period, then it doesn't matter if they are being taken to some beautiful place by some beautiful chazen's voice, right? There's no worry about that because they can give a few words and it won't matter. But for a man, that's not the case. A man has to have kavanah and has to daven those 3 services throughout the day, or else they haven't fulfilled an obligation that they have as a man. So I know that doesn't answer your full question, Bonnie, but there are ways in which our sages were aware of the fact that it's not just female voices that are beautiful. There are many females who have terrible voices, and if they sing, that's going to do nothing for you. So there are ways in which this is definitely able to go across the genders. It's just more spoken about in terms of female voices.
My question has much more to do with was there any thinking about, gee, I'm responsible for my own behavior. The women are not responsible for my behavior, and therefore we need to come up with something that men can do so that we don't have to impose our will. Is there any commentary about that? How can there not be? They have the same number of brain cells as we do. And their thinking is just as broad as ours. It seems strange to me that there would not be any commentary, or maybe they just didn't want it to be written down.
No, so much of the Talmud is focused on things that men can do to try to avoid putting them in situations where they're, compromised. Their thoughts are compromised, right? That's like a huge topic in the Talmud. So there's sort of almost two separate conversations to be had. One about women in front of men, and it's sort of more a restriction on men, saying men shouldn't be in places where women are singing. And we said, of course, then that ends up affecting women in terms of what kind of places they can sing in, but it's framed in terms of men because the Talmud is written by men, and in many cases is written for men. Obviously, certain areas are focused on women primarily, but in general, it's for men. And there's a ton of the Talmud is around those things. And there was a great video a couple of years ago. Some people were very offended by it, but Yonatan Razel, who's a fantastic Israeli singer, religious, was doing a concert for women, and the women there were dancing. They started dancing, and he covered his eyes. I forget if he put tape on his eyes or a blindfold or something like that. And some people were super upset about it, and they're like, "Oh, this is terrible that he's doing this." And other people were like, "This is beautiful. He's playing the piano and singing, and people are dancing." And he's like, "Okay, I'm not going to stop playing because women are dancing. I'm going to cover my face so I'm not seeing women dancing, but not stop them from dancing." You seem like you have a different response to that video than I did, Rebecca. But I thought it was
great story. I'm not sure that is exactly what Bonnie will want to hear in terms of just the fact that I think that that's still making it the woman's problem, right? A bunch of what he knew he was performing at a female concert, I assume, or else he needs to fire his, agent. But he knew what he was getting himself into. So to then put tape over his eyes in that kind of setting, that is not good. Very entertaining story, but not good. I think that one of the maybe better stories would be that the idea of a mechitza, right, of not having men and women be, and in some places the mechitza is one where you won't even hear the women. In other places it's that you won't see the women. In other places it's that there are a few trees and you can see everybody. But the idea of separation is such that you would have more kavanah, you would have more intention in the way in which you are praying. And it's not put there because men need it more than women, though there's obviously more of a nod to that in the sources that Rabbi Pernick was referring to. But also for women to be able to have their own space and their own, I really like davening with a mechitza, just because I get to be in my own space. And I think that that's something that if it's looked at in that way, as opposed to a sexist separation, you can't be with the other gender, that is a way in which men can then be focused without having to worry on their prayers and their section, the things that are going on their side. But you're right, Bonnie. There's a lot of, we've only spoken so far about things in which it's not so great to hear that women need to be muted or somehow taken down from their existence just so that men can be better established in the world that they're supposed to be living in. It's not okay. And that is something that over generations we are working at and making sure that that is something in the liberal world of Judaism that we are doing a better job at. But your frustration and your angst is right on. And I'll just add a quick story, and then Rabbi Pernick, you can either call on people or close, whatever you want. When I was in when I was in college, I had started an a cappella group. It was a Jewish a cappella group. It was mixed. There were men and women in it. I happened to be very involved in a group, a Jewish organization called Isha. We're going to have that conversation another time. And I was very close with the Isha Rabbi and his wife and their kids. And my a cappella group wanted to go to their home to sing for Hanukkah. So we did. They were very excited about it. They had it because it's a mixed group. Remember, there are men and women. They had us come. They were very excited about it. And the one thing that I forgot, or maybe didn't even know at the time, I don't know. The one thing that I forgot was that I sang a solo for a song that, I have sung a million times and never gave any thought to it. We were in their living room. I started to sing, and he put his hands over his ears. And I will never forget that moment because I didn't care if he didn't like my voice. I didn't care about any of that. But he was he could have left the room and I would have felt better about it. It was such a visceral reaction to hearing just my voice. It was so painful, so painful. And I love the guy. I still think very highly of him. That didn't change my perception of him as a human. But I do think that there are ways in which we can go about being more conscientious and more aware of this, both me as the singer and also he as the listener, to be able to say, this is not going to be something I'm comfortable with. I'm going to remove myself without making other people feel uncomfortable. So that, to me, that is the way, in which this episode resolves itself, that they figure out a way that he does not have to be uncomfortable, that she still gets to learn Haftarah, and that ultimately they are learning from one another. So that's, I don't know, that's my hope, that's my take on Kol Isha, and yeah.
He's still uncomfortable.
What?
He's still uncomfortable. I said he's still uncomfortable.
He's still uncomfortable, but he's doing it, and he found a way.
He's still uncomfortable with it, but he's doing it.
But he's not closing his ear. He's not putting tape over his eyes. Like he knows what's going on, and he found a way that he can. Oh, by the way, my favorite part about this class is that your parents are laughing when I'm talking. That makes me very happy. That they're finding a way to make it work, and that's important. That he can be a little uncomfortable with something that he knows is actually okay in the way that they're doing it.
I think putting tape over your eyes is also like a...
Stop while you're...
It inspired very different reactions, because some people were like, this is awful, which is like my shots.
That is
some were like, this is... All these women came to hear him sing, and he wanted to perform without being... he didn't want to impose anything and say, I can't play because you're dancing. No, you don't like it. I like it.
You're wrong. You're just wrong. But it's okay. It's fine. You can be wrong. I can be right. It's okay. We can move on.
Any final questions before we break for the night?
That's a great place to end. I was right. You're wrong. We should end on that note.
Yonatan Razel is great, by the way. You should all listen to Yonatan Razel.
He is great.
I have a bit of trivia. The woman who plays Shira, she was actually one of the stars of the show Mossad 101. It was a somewhat satirical, semi-serious takeoff on the Mossad, and she played a psychologist. And that was in 2000, I think, 15, as opposed to this is 2009 in Srugim.
Interesting. Yeah. I saw the Friedmans raise their hand. Are they?
Hi, I had a question as a slight tangent over here about Torah reading in the synagogue. Mm-hmm. It's my understanding that in the synagogue you're required to read Torah every week. I have an acquaintance who was an Orthodox rabbi newly minted Orthodox rabbi in Sacramento. And a couple of years ago, when there were some severe fires nearby, they couldn't hold Shabbat services, and they actually canceled the services. And he was trying to figure out what they were supposed to do since they couldn't read the Torah on Shabbat. And now, of course, with COVID, you have lots of synagogues that can't meet or not supposed to be meeting. And I'm just wondering what the obligation is about in terms of reading Torah in the synagogue and how you get around that problem.
Great. So I can answer that. The obligation to read Torah is an obligation on the kahal. It's an obligation on the community. A kahal only exists when there is a minyan, when there's a group of, in an Orthodox context, 10 men. So there actually isn't an obligation to read Torah if there isn't a kahal, if there isn't a minyan. So if you have a minyan on Shabbat and you don't read Torah, that's a problem. If you don't have a minyan, it's actually not an issue to not read Torah, because there's no minyan that, the obligation only exists once the minyan is there. Now, with that said, there's an idea, when there's like an established shul or an established minyan, that even if they don't have a minyan 1 week, like there's still an established group who's coming back together. So this was a source of, I don't know if for Rabbi Schatz in the conservative world, but certainly was a topic of a lot of conversation in the Orthodox world, because in theory, what you're supposed to do is if there's sort of an established synagogue that can't meet for a week because of whatever reason, they can't read Torah, they're supposed to make it up the following week. And the first aliyah is the entire previous week's parsha plus the first aliyah. So you have like a whole Torah reading plus an aliyah as Rishon, it's the first aliyah, and then the rest of the Torah reading goes as normal. That's in theory what you're supposed to do. Now, when you miss like 5 months of of services, what do you do about that? So that's where we pull out the great Tircha de Tzibora line that it's what's the good translation for tircha?
It's a burden on the community.
It's a burden on the community, and so basically we don't do that. But if it was 1 week, like there are places that if they missed 1 week, they would actually make it up the following week and just do a double parsha. But
it would still be a tircha after 1 week. It'd still be.
It's also a tircha after 1 week. It's definitely a tircha after
8 months.
All of Vayikra and Bamidbar and half of Devarim. Yeah.
So. I think, Leonard, the interesting thing that Rabbi Pernick is pointing out is that even though we might feel like we are a community, no matter if we are meeting in person or not, a kahal is defined by actually being in the same place with a minyan. So, we call one another a community and we feel very communal, but in terms of the definition of kahal for a mitzvah, you have to have a minyan to be able to do it, which is why at Temple Beth Am, for example, we're not reading Torah out of a scroll and haven't for many, many months. But the one thing that we are doing is we have given Torah scrolls to different homes that are having backyard minyanim, and they are reading Torah. So in a way, our kahal is reading Torah when they're gathering in the backyard minyan.
Okay, that's a good ending point.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.